A few years ago, I went hiking with my uncle in one of the most remote places I've ever been. It was somewhere right on the border of Montana and Idaho. I honestly can't remember the exact spot anymore, but I remember everything else about that day. The trail was about 6 miles in, 6 miles out, ending at a lake that hardly anyone visited. Just to get to the trailhead took us at least 20 miles on rough logging roads. The kind of drive where you don't see another vehicle, you don't pass any homes, and the trees crowd so close to the road that you feel swallowed up by the forest. When we pulled into the small dirt lot at the trailhead, our truck was the only one there. No other hikers, no tire tracks that looked fresh. It already felt like we were very far from anywhere normal. The first part of the hike was calm enough. The trail wound through thick woods, then opened into long stretches of ridgeline where you could see for miles. It was hot that day, but not unbearable, and the silence was the kind that only comes in really wild places. Even when you stopped and listened, you didn't hear cars in the distance, or planes overhead, or chainsaws or anything human. Just the occasional bird, the rustle of trees, and your own footsteps. I remember thinking how empty it all felt, and in a way it was comforting. But in the back of my mind, I also knew that if something happened out there, it could be days before anyone else came by. A few miles in, we noticed something odd. Just off the trail to our right, in a small clearing, there was a makeshift camp. It wasn't a designated campsite. This wasn't the kind of trail where people set up camp along the way, but someone had picked that spot anyway. A tent was pitched there, and a few items were scattered around. At first glance, it looked messy. Nothing neat about it, just kind of thrown together. There wasn't anyone visible. No fire going, no movement, no voices. Just the tent sitting there, half hidden by trees. We slowed down a little, looked it over, then kept going. It struck me as odd, but not alarming. People camp in weird places sometimes. We didn't linger. We had 6 miles to the lake, and we wanted to make it there before the day got too far along. The lake itself was beautiful. When we reached it, the water was still and clear, ringed with rocks and tall trees. We sat there for a while, ate lunch, and just rested our legs. The hike out was going to be the same distance, and we wanted to make sure we weren't too tired. The whole time, though, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about that camp. Something about it didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just because it was so out of place, or maybe it was because we hadn't seen a single other person all day. It was a lonely spot for someone to pitch a tent, and I knew it was the kind of area where you had to be careful with food because of bears. But whoever was camping there hadn't seemed careful. Later in the afternoon, we packed up and started the hike back. The trail looked different heading in the opposite direction. Landmarks you barely noticed on the way in stood out more on the way out. The camp was coming up again, this time on our left. From this side of the trail, we could see it sooner than before. At first, it looked exactly the same. Tent in the clearing, a few items around. But as we got closer, I had this deep, uneasy feeling. The tent flap was hanging wide open, completely unzipped. That detail stuck out right away. On the hike in, the flap had been zipped shut. Now it wasn't. I slowed down. My uncle kept walking, but I lingered. Something about it made me want to stop and really look. I scanned the camp carefully, expecting someone to appear. Nobody did. The tent was silent, empty looking. The air around us felt heavier, and I remember realizing how quiet everything had gone. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just stillness. By the time we reached the camp, I felt uneasy enough that I called out. I don't even know why. Maybe I thought someone inside was hurt. Maybe I thought if I didn't say something I'd regret it later. My voice sounded strange in the silence, bouncing off the trees. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. I started to step closer, my uncle hanging back about 10 paces behind. He clearly didn't want to be involved, but I couldn't let it go. I kept moving forward, slowly, looking around as I went. Nothing stirred. When I finally stood right in front of the tent, I hesitated. The flap was pulled wide open, and inside I could see a sleeping bag laid out perfectly. Not crumpled, not tossed, just unrolled neatly across the floor. The tent itself was high quality, big, sturdy, with a vestibule. Everything about the tent said that the person who owned it knew what they were doing. But everything else about the camp was off. Nobody who spent money on gear like that would leave their tent wide open in bear country. Nobody would just abandon it like this. I stepped inside a little, peered around. The sleeping bag looked like it had barely been touched. No clothes thrown around, no backpack sitting in the corner. Just the bag perfectly straight. I backed out and looked around the clearing again. That's when I started noticing the details I'd missed earlier. There were items scattered beyond the tent, spaced out almost deliberately. A small bundle of something on a rock, something else leaning against a log. I decided to follow them. About 100 feet away, I spotted a large boulder near a narrow stream. On top of it was a Ziploc bag. I picked it up and found strips of raw bacon inside. I stood there for a long time holding that bag, trying to process it. Bacon, raw, sitting out in the sun, right next to a water source. No stove, no frying pan, no cooler. Nothing you'd need to cook it. Just meat in plastic, left in the middle of nowhere. Who brings bacon on a backpacking trip like this? Who leaves it out where it will draw animals right to the camp? I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I put it back on the rock exactly where I found it, then turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods. Still nothing, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I walked back to the tent area, I noticed more things on the ground that hadn't stood out before. Rounds from a .45 handgun. A few spent casings mixed in with them. Not a pile, but scattered, as if they'd been dropped there and left. The sight of them made my stomach knot up. Nothing about this camp made sense anymore. A nice tent, a neatly unrolled sleeping bag, no food or supplies except a bag of bacon left on a rock, shell casings lying around, and no person. No backpack, no boots, no sign of life. That was the moment I decided it wasn't just strange. It was bad. My uncle was already urging me to move. His face was pale, and he didn't want to stay a second longer. I nodded, and we both started walking fast, almost jogging. We didn't talk, we just kept our heads down and pushed for the trailhead. I counted steps in my head to calm myself down, and by the time I figured it out, the camp was about a mile from where we'd parked. That was too close for comfort. If whoever owned that camp came back, they'd know the trailhead was near. And if they were out there watching us, they knew exactly where we were headed. The last mile out felt longer than the rest of the hike combined. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain we were being followed. My chest was tight. My legs moved faster than I thought they could. When the trail finally broke into the dirt lot, I nearly ran to the truck. The relief of seeing it sitting there untouched was huge, but it didn't erase the tension. We climbed in, shut the doors, and locked them. The engine roared to life, and we pulled out onto the road. Only when the trailhead was out of sight did I let myself breathe fully again. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every detail. The open tent flap, the sleeping bag, the bacon, the casings, the silence. I kept wondering what had happened there. Why would someone leave their camp like that? Why no food, no pack, no stove? Why bacon in a bag, of all things? And the shells, who fires off rounds at a camp, then leaves without picking them up? The whole scene didn't add up. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't someone going for a hike and planning to come back. It was wrong in a way I can't explain. Even now, years later, I don't have an answer. I never went back to that area. I don't think I ever will. The memory of that camp still lingers in the back of my mind. It felt like walking into a story that had already started, one we weren't supposed to see, and we walked out before it ended. I don't know if the person who owned that tent was out there watching us. I don't know if they ever came back. But I do know this, something happened in that clearing, and whatever it was, we didn't want to be there when it finished. That was the only time I ever felt truly unsafe in the wilderness. Not because of animals, not because of weather, but because of people. The forest was silent. The camp was abandoned, and all the signs pointed to something I couldn't explain. We made it out, but I still think about it, and every time I do, I get the same uneasy feeling I had standing in front of that open tent. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be understood, and that camp was one of them. I still remember that night like it happened yesterday, even though it's been decades since then. It was one of those memories that stays stuck in your mind, whether you want it to or not, and the older I get, the more I realize how close we came to something we probably shouldn't have walked away from. I was in my 20s, and like a lot of people at that age, I thought I was tougher and smarter than I really was. That night reminded me how quickly things can turn, and how being in the wrong place at the wrong time can stick with you for life. It was late, well past midnight, and my buddy and I were out driving around back roads in South Alabama. That was something we did a lot back then. Gas was cheaper, we didn't have much money for real entertainment, and honestly, driving into the middle of nowhere, smoking a cigarette with the windows down, maybe drinking a beer or two, and just talking about life was as good as anything else. It wasn't unusual for us to take roads we'd never been down before just to see where they went. Those back roads could go on forever, twisting through pine woods and swampy patches, leading to places that looked like they hadn't changed in 100 years. That night, we ended up on one of those roads. It was dirt, narrow, with deep ruts from trucks that had run over it after rains. It wound between thick walls of trees and then suddenly opened into these little fields with old, leaning fences and sometimes no sign of life at all. You could drive for miles and not see a house or another vehicle. It was one of those places where if your car broke down, you'd be in real trouble. We passed an old cemetery, the kind that looks like it hasn't been touched since the 1800s. The headstones were small, uneven, some leaning so far they looked like they'd fall if the wind hit them hard enough. Most of the graves didn't even have proper markers, just slabs of stone stuck in the ground. The whole place was half swallowed by weeds and trees. I remember thinking it was strange to have a graveyard that far off the main road, almost hidden from the world. You could drive right past and not even know it was there if your headlights weren't angled the right way. It was right after that cemetery when everything started. Out of nowhere, a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone else heading home late, maybe another person out on a joyride like us. But on those roads, seeing another car at that hour was rare enough to feel wrong. The truck came up fast, too fast, and before I knew it, the guy was right on my bumper. The road wasn't wide enough for him to pass, but he didn't back off either. He stayed glued to me, close enough that I couldn't see his headlights without the glare filling up the entire mirror. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It felt like he wanted me to know he was there, and that he wasn't going anywhere. I pressed down on the gas. The Volvo wagon I was driving wasn't built for racing, but it could handle itself if I pushed it. The dirt road twisted and turned like a snake, and every corner I took threw up clouds of dust so thick I could barely see. I hoped the dust would blind the guy behind me, but he stayed right there, eating every curve like he'd driven it 100 times before. His headlights cut through the haze, steady, never pulling back. I started feeling that panic crawl up inside me, the kind where your chest gets tight and your hands start to sweat no matter how hard you grip the wheel. My friend was sitting in the passenger seat, tense, watching the mirror as much as I was watching the road. He knew the area better than I did, and he leaned forward, scanning for landmarks through the trees. He finally told me there was a paved road up ahead where the dirt road ended in AT, and off to the left there was another little spur road, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. He said if I could just gain a little ground, I might be able to whip the car into that spur fast enough to lose the truck. That was the only plan we had. I kept my foot down, letting the car bounce and slide through the turns, feeling every rut and dip throw the wheels out from under me. I was terrified of losing control, but even more terrified of what would happen if I slowed down. The truck wasn't just following us anymore. It was hunting us. The trees opened just enough to let me see the pale reflection of pavement ahead. I knew that was the T. I also knew I'd have one shot to make the turn sharp and fast enough to get out of sight before the truck closed in. My hands were slick with sweat, my shirt stuck to my back, but I gripped the wheel and lined myself up. Just before I hit the paved road, my headlights lit up something that made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the truck behind me. On the far side of the road, just inside the tree line, was a figure. It was so tall it looked wrong, like someone stretched out of proportion. From head to toe it looked covered in long, matted hair. Not neat like someone with long hair, but wild, unkempt, hanging in strands. For the split second my headlights caught it, I could see its arms hanging down too far, its frame almost blending with the shadows of the trees. It wasn't an animal, not the way it stood. And it wasn't dressed like a person either. There was nothing about it that made sense. My brain tried to process it, but I didn't have time. I yanked the wheel hard, tires screaming against the dirt as I shot into the little spur road. The wagon fishtailed, gravel rattling against the undercarriage, but I held it steady and pushed forward. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The truck behind me roared past the intersection, still locked onto the road I'd been on. Whether he didn't see me turn or couldn't stop in time, I don't know. But within seconds his headlights disappeared into the distance. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence except for the sound of the engine and my own ragged breathing. I didn't stop. I kept driving down that spur road, not even sure where it would take us. My hands shook on the wheel, and the image of that figure by the trees burned into my head. I wanted to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump or vines hanging down. But deep down, I knew I had seen something real, something that had no business being there. We eventually came out on another stretch of paved road and kept driving until we reached a small town with lights and people. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the fluorescent glow, and sat there with my hands still locked on the wheel. My friend was pale, staring straight ahead. We didn't talk much about it that night. There wasn't much to say. Looking back now, all these years later, I've tried to make sense of it. The truck, at least I can understand. There are always people who get a kick out of scaring strangers, especially in places where you're isolated and vulnerable. Maybe it was a local who didn't like outsiders driving through, maybe someone drunk looking for trouble. Whatever his reason, he wanted us off that road, and we were lucky to get away without finding out what he had planned. But the figure in the trees, that's something I've never been able to explain. It wasn't a ghost or some made-up creature. It was real. It stood there solid and silent, watching. Maybe it was a person, someone who had been living out in those woods so long that they didn't look right anymore. Maybe it was some drifter, someone surviving in a way most people couldn't imagine. That thought is honestly worse than anything else, because if it was a person, then they saw us and we saw them, and that meant we weren't alone out there at all. What sticks with me most is that timing. Out of all the nights, all the roads, and all the miles of empty woods, what are the chances that I would see that figure at the exact second I was trying to save my life from that truck? If I had looked a second earlier or later, maybe I'd never know it was there. But I did see it, clear enough that even decades later I can close my eyes and picture it exactly where it stood, half in shadow, half lit by my headlights. That was the last time I drove those roads at night. I stayed away from that whole area after that. It wasn't just the truck that scared me, though that was bad enough. It was knowing there were things out there I couldn't understand, things that didn't care if I made it home safe or not. I was young and thought I knew danger when I saw it. That night taught me different. I've told the story a few times over the years, but I leave out some of the details. People already look at me sideways when I describe the truck chasing us down a dirt road by an old cemetery in the middle of nowhere. If I tell them about the tall, hairy figure standing in the trees, they either laugh it off or ask if I was drunk or high. I wasn't. I wish I had been, because then I'd have a reason for seeing what I saw. But I was clear as day, and so was my friend. There's no neat bow to tie on the end of this story. No explanation came later, no one confessed to chasing us, and no article popped up in the news about some wild man living in the woods. We drove out there, we were chased, we saw something we couldn't explain, and we got out alive. That's it. And honestly, that's enough. This happened back in the 80s when I was in my early 20s. I was living in a small town in the Northwest at the time, working odd jobs, trying to figure out who I was and where I was going. I didn't have much money, and I wasn't really interested in bars or crowds. What I did crave was quiet, and what I wanted more than anything was space where I could be alone with myself. I had always loved the woods, the high ridges, the smell of pine needles warming in the sun, the sound of running water in lonely valleys. Being out there made me feel more like myself than anything else did. I also had Oberon, my yellow tiger cat. He was an odd one, overbite that made his mouth look crooked, constant drooling, and a purr so loud it sounded like an old lawn mower, but he was mine and he was perfect. He loved riding in the car. I'd open the passenger window just a crack and he would sit up on the seat, whiskers blowing in the breeze, completely content. Looking back, I know that going off alone into the woods like I used to was reckless. A young woman driving up into logging country by herself, parking off abandoned roads with no one around for miles. It was stupid, and I can't honestly recommend it to anyone. But back then, I felt like I needed it. I needed the solitude, I needed the sense of bravery, and I needed the reset it gave me. I packed the car with my tent, sleeping bag, a few books, sketch pad, paints, and enough food to feel like I was treating myself rather than just surviving. I wasn't roughing it the way real backpackers did. I would just drive until a road felt right, follow it until I found a place that felt private but not threatening, and set myself up for a night or two. On one of those trips, Oberon and I had already spent a night out on a gravel pull-off deep in National Forest land. The next morning, after an unhurried breakfast and some sketching by a stream, I packed up and decided to keep driving further in. My map showed a network of old logging roads and BLM roads that spidered out in all directions. Most were grown over, some had locked gates, but a few were open. I chose one that angled uphill and was still navigable. It wound around ridges and through stands of fir and cedar until it finally opened up onto a long, sloping meadow. A narrow stream curved along the far edge, trees bordering it, and on the near side, close to where the road edged the grass, was a wide, flat boulder about the size of a kitchen table. The moment I saw it, I knew I had found my spot. It felt almost designed for what I wanted: quiet, sunlit grass, the sound of water nearby, the boulder like a ready-made table for a proper lunch. I parked the car in the shade just off the road, stepped out, and stretched. Oberon hopped down after me, tail flicking as he started his slow, deliberate survey of the place. He was always careful but curious, and I trusted him more than I should have to sense things. I set about preparing lunch in the way I always like to do it, not just grabbing food but laying it out. I spread a small placemat across the boulder, placed a cloth napkin, set down my sandwich still wrapped neatly in foil on a plate, a small knife beside it, a couple of cookies, and a cold bottle of dark beer that I'd been saving for the perfect sunny day. I even set a little bowl of kibble for Oberon. The scene was almost funny. A picnic set for two. Me and a cat who couldn't have cared less about anything except sniffing at grass and flicking his tail at the bugs buzzing past. Before I sat down, I thought I'd better go fetch him since he had wandered into the trees on the far side of the meadow. I walked after him, calling softly, until I found him pawing at a fallen branch and sniffing at moss. I picked him up, pressed my face against his fur, and turned back toward camp. It was the kind of afternoon that makes you forget that the world has edges. The air was warm but not heavy. The breeze kept it fresh, and the meadow looked like something out of a painting, golden grass shifting in ripples, the stream glinting between dark tree trunks, the sky a pale, endless blue. We hadn't been gone long at all, 10, maybe 15 minutes. When I came back through the edge of the trees and the boulder came into view, the first thing I noticed was that the beer bottle was tipped sideways. For a moment, I thought the wind must have knocked it, but then I got closer and everything inside me went cold. The food was gone, every bit of it. The sandwich, the cookies, even Oberon's kibble bowl was licked clean. The foil that had been wrapped around my sandwich was crumpled into a tight little ball and left on the stone. The beer bottle was empty, the cap off and the opener sitting right next to it like someone had placed it there with care. The napkin was no longer folded neatly, but had been opened and then laid back down, folded loosely as if used. The knife was set across the empty plate, not dropped, not tossed, placed. I stood there with Oberon clutched in my arms and felt a wave of shock roll through me so fast I couldn't even breathe right. At first my mind tried to catch up by offering easy explanations. An animal had come by, a raccoon maybe. But raccoons don't open beer bottles. They don't crumple foil into balls. They don't fold napkins or lay knives neatly across plates. The realization landed heavy. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up while I was only a few yards away in the trees and eaten my meal like it belonged to them. Not only eaten it, but done so with care, leaving the setting almost intact, as though mocking me. Every instinct screamed at me to get out. My hands shook so badly that Oberon squirmed, claws digging into my arm. I turned and ran across the meadow toward the car, heart thudding so loud it drowned out everything else. My mind was split between scanning the trees for movement and trying not to imagine footsteps behind me. I yanked the door open, shoved Oberon inside, and slid into the driver's seat. My hands fumbled on the keys before I got the car started. I spun the car around on the narrow road, gravel spitting under the tires, and drove fast down the hill, pulse hammering, the steering wheel slick under my palms. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, certain I would see someone step out into the road behind me. But as I drove, another thought hit me so hard that I had to slam the brakes on the downhill grade. My back seat. I hadn't checked it. In all my hurry, I hadn't looked. What if whoever had eaten my lunch was crouched right there, inches away, waiting? My chest tightened so much I could barely breathe. I sat gripping the wheel, shaking. Finally, I forced myself to turn, yanked the seat forward, and look, the back seat was empty. No one there, just the pile of my sleeping bag and gear. Relief hit, but it didn't steady me much. I kept driving until I reached pavement again, and then until I reached the edge of town. When I finally stopped, it was at the house of a friend. I remember parking crooked, stumbling up the steps with Oberon still pressed against my chest, and telling the story in broken pieces until I got it out. They all looked at me with the same expression, half disbelief, half fear, because the truth was, there was no good explanation. No one should have been out there, not on that road, not in that meadow. And if they had been, what kind of person eats a stranger's lunch with that kind of precision and then disappears without a word or a sound? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boulder, the neat knife across the empty plate, the folded napkin. I kept thinking how close I had been, how I had been walking in the trees maybe only 50 feet away while someone else sat at that rock, eating my food, watching my car, maybe even watching me. I still went camping after that, but it wasn't the same for a long time. My courage came back slowly, but it never came back in full. I stopped setting things out neatly, stopped treating it like a little ritual of elegance. I never again walked away from my car without checking and double-checking my surroundings. The woods were still beautiful, still calling to me, but after that day, they never felt as safe. And even now, decades later, when I think of that meadow, it isn't the sunlight or the stream or the soft grass that comes to mind. It's the sudden emptiness of that rock, the feeling of being watched without knowing from where, and the weight of realizing just how close danger can sit, silent and unseen, while you think you are alone. A few summers ago, I was on a long canoe trip with a couple of friends in the Boundary Waters. We had planned it for months, saved up vacation time, gathered gear, and picked a route that would take us far away from the busy entry points. That was the whole point of going out there. No crowds, no cell signal, no noise but the wind in the trees and the sound of paddles hitting water. We wanted that kind of quiet that you only get when you know the nearest road is days away. We had been paddling and portaging for about 4 days, moving deeper and deeper into that maze of lakes and channels. The days blurred into each other. Mornings filled with mist rising off the water, long afternoons spent pulling the canoe across stretches of calm, glassy water, and evenings finding whatever campsite we could before dark. Each lake felt more remote than the last. By that point, we hadn't seen another group for 2 days, which felt both peaceful and slightly eerie. The Boundary Waters has that effect. You start to feel like you're the last people on Earth. That day was hot, the kind of heat where your shirt sticks to your back, and every break on shore is an excuse to dunk your head into the lake. We had crossed 2 portages already and were hoping to find a site sooner rather than later. Around late afternoon, we came upon an island, maybe a couple 100 yards wide. From a distance, I could see the flat rock landing that usually means a campsite. Sure enough, when we pulled up, there was the little U.S. Forest Service fire grate stuck in the dirt. We were tired, sore, and sunburned, so finding it felt like luck. But the second we stepped onto the site, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away. Just that sense that the air was heavier here, like something about the place wasn't right. At first, it looked like any other site. A few flat spots for tents, a ring of trees around the edges, and a decent view of the lake from the fire pit. But then I noticed the gear. Brand new gear. A sleeping bag lying half open, stuffed halfway into the dirt. A camping pad rolled out under a tree. Both looked like they had barely been used, no dirt stains, no rips. Just left there like someone had set up camp and walked away. I thought maybe someone had gotten hurt and been airlifted out, but the more I looked, the less that theory held up. There wasn't just one or two pieces of gear. There were little signs of a whole camp that had been abandoned in a hurry. A water bottle still full, a boot missing its pair, food wrappers scattered around like they had been dropped mid-meal. Then I noticed the sticks. At first I thought they were just burnt sticks from old fires. But no, they had been deliberately stuck into the ground, angled upward, the tips blackened and charred. They were placed around the campsite in no particular order, just here and there like someone had gone around with a torch and planted them. I counted at least a dozen. At the fire pit, things got even stranger. Inside the ashes, someone had burned more than wood. Right in the center of the charred mess was a toothbrush, melted and blackened but still recognizable. Next to it, what looked like the remains of a wallet, the leather warped and shriveled, with the corner of an ID card fused into it. I saw the bent wire frames of a pair of glasses, half sunk in ash. There were scraps of clothing too, all burned until they were stiff and brittle. Papers, maybe maps or notebooks, had been thrown in and torched as well. It wasn't the normal trash you'd find in a campsite fire. It looked like someone had tried to destroy everything that belonged to them. The creepiest thing, though, wasn't at the fire. It was near the edge of the campsite, down where the ground sloped toward the rocks. There, wedged between two boulders, was a single moose antler. It was bleached pale, probably from sun and age, but someone had placed it upright like it was meant to stand guard. Around it was a perfect ring of charred sticks, smaller than the others but clearly arranged with care. It looked like some kind of ritual, something deliberate. The sight of it made the hair on my arms rise. I couldn't explain why, but it was one of the most unsettling things I had ever come across. It wasn't just litter or carelessness. Someone had done this on purpose, and whatever reason they had wasn't clear. We all stood there in silence for a long while, none of us wanting to be the first to say what we were all thinking. This wasn't the kind of campsite you shrug off. This was the kind you back away from. Even though we were exhausted, none of us wanted to spend the night there. It wasn't even a discussion. We loaded the canoe back up and pushed off without saying much. The sun was dipping low by then, and we had no real plan for where we were going to sleep. We just paddled hard, putting as much water between us and that island as possible before it got dark. That night we ended up crammed onto a tiny peninsula, barely enough flat ground for our tents, mosquitoes swarming in clouds around us. It didn't matter. None of us wanted to be back there. I remember lying in my tent, staring at the ceiling of nylon, my body buzzing with exhaustion but my mind refusing to shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moose antler in its ring of blackened sticks, standing in silence like some marker of something we weren't supposed to find. Over the next couple of days, we didn't talk about it much. It was like we all silently agreed not to, but I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to piece together what could have happened. The new gear, the personal belongings burned in the fire, the strange arrangement of sticks, the antler like a centerpiece. It all pointed to someone who had either lost their mind out there or had done something they wanted to erase. I thought about the wallet the most. Whoever it belonged to hadn't just left. They had tried to wipe out their presence completely. Destroying ID, glasses, papers, those are things you'd want to keep unless you wanted to vanish. Or unless you wanted to make sure no one could identify what happened to you. We never saw anyone else that trip. Never heard about a missing camper when we got back. Never found any explanation. It just lingered as this unsolved question in the back of my head. Every time I've thought about going back to the Boundary Waters since, I've remembered that sight. The way the air felt heavy the moment I stepped onto it. The silence that hung over us while we stood staring at that fire pit. The rush to get away before the sun dipped behind the trees. Out there, the wilderness can swallow things whole. Campsites, people, stories, they all fade back into the trees and water. What we saw on that island is probably still there, slowly being covered by moss and dirt, the sticks falling over, the antler bleaching further in the sun. Maybe someone else has stumbled across it since, maybe not. But I know for certain I will never go near that island again. Even now, years later, when I think back on it, I get that same crawling feeling under my skin. The kind of feeling that tells you some places are better left behind, and some questions don't need answers. We left that island for good, and I've never stopped being grateful that we did. I had been looking forward to that trip in the Goat Rocks wilderness for months. My friend and I had planned it out carefully, checked the maps, packed everything down to the ounce, and made sure we had enough food for the days we were going to be out there. We had both been backpacking before, but this was one of those places that felt a little more remote, a little more wild, the kind of area where you knew you weren't going to see too many people once you got up into the basins and valleys. That was the appeal. It was the middle of summer, and the plan was simple. Hike up past the tree line into one of the high basins, set up camp, and spend a few days exploring ridgelines and passes that looked down over endless mountains. Things didn't go as smoothly as planned right from the start. The drive-in took way longer than we expected. There was road construction, long waits, and even after we finally got past all of that, the dirt roads seemed slower than what we'd planned for. By the time we reached the trailhead and had our packs strapped on, it was late afternoon, way later than what you'd want for a hike that had you climbing up into the high country. We both knew it, but there wasn't much we could do. We wanted to get to that basin, and we pushed forward knowing daylight was slipping away. My friend hikes much faster than I do. He's the kind of guy who likes to keep his head down and grind up the miles, while I usually settle into a slower pace, looking around more, taking my time. That difference started to show pretty quickly. Within an hour, he was out ahead of me, and I only caught glimpses of him now and then as the trail curved or opened up. I didn't think much of it because we both knew the plan. Take the boot path off the main trail, climb up into the basin, find a spot to set camp before it got dark. Easy enough on paper, except when I reached the point where the boot path split from the main trail, he was nowhere in sight. I stood there for a moment with my pack biting into my shoulders, staring up at the steep trail that clawed its way up through the trees toward the basin. It was already dim under the canopy. The thought of climbing that steep stretch alone with no clear sign of my friend didn't sit right. I waited a few minutes, thinking maybe he'd pop back down, but the woods stayed empty. Eventually, I decided to backtrack. There had been a small lake with established campsites about 3/4 of a mile back, right off the trail. I figured that was safer than heading into the basin alone with darkness closing in. By the time I reached the lake, it was almost completely dark. I found a wide, open area that looked like it had been used as a horse camp in the past, flat and clear enough to set up without stumbling around too much. I dropped my pack, pulled out my tent, and got everything pitched under the glow of my headlamp. The lake was close, maybe a couple minutes walk, and the trees opened up enough that I could see a stretch of sky above me. It wasn't the basin, but it would do. An hour later, my friend finally showed up, sheepish but relieved. He had gone too far up the boot path, realized I wasn't behind him, and had to backtrack down in the dark to find me. By then, we were both tired, hungry, and glad to have a flat spot to stop. We cooked a quick meal, the kind of backpacking food you shovel down just to get calories in, and then retreated to our own one-person tents. We didn't talk much, just said we'd figure things out in the morning. The thing about sleeping in the backcountry is that it never really feels like sleep. At least not for me. I've never been able to sink into deep rest with thin nylon walls between me and the night. My friend, on the other hand, was out cold within minutes. I could hear his steady breathing through the stillness. For me, though, my brain wouldn't shut off. I lay there with my headlamp off, staring into the darkness of the tent, listening to every snap of a twig, every distant rustle. You tell yourself it's just the forest doing what forests do. Branches dropping, pine cones falling, wind moving through leaves. But your imagination has a way of twisting those sounds into things that creep closer and closer. At some point, maybe 3 hours after I had crawled into my sleeping bag, I heard something different. Footsteps. Not close at first, but distinct enough that I froze in place and held my breath. Heavy, deliberate steps. Not the quick, scattered sounds of a small animal moving through brush. This was something big. My first thought was deer or elk, But the sound was different from that too. It had a weight to it, and the steps fell in pairs, left then right, like something walking upright. I lay there, my ears straining, trying to pick out the rhythm. It didn't sound like 4 hooves. It didn't sound like the light, erratic padding of a bear. It sounded like a person, a very heavy person. Each step pressed down hard enough that I could almost feel the vibration through the ground beneath me. The steps circled somewhere out beyond camp, maybe 100 feet away, moving slowly, stopping for long stretches. My friend didn't stir at all. The silence in between was almost worse than the steps themselves. When the woods go dead quiet, when even the crickets stop, that's when your brain starts filling in blanks you don't want filled. Then it happened. The sound tore through the night with a force that didn't seem possible. A deep, booming bellow that shook through my chest like a shockwave. It was so loud, so sudden, that for a second I couldn't even process it. It was like a whistle from an old steam train, but deeper, harsher, filled with something primal. Somewhere between a cow's drawn-out call and a lion's roar, except amplified to the point where it rolled through the valley and bounced back in long, hollow echoes. I don't think I've ever gone from half asleep to wide awake so fast in my life. My heart was slamming in my chest, pounding so hard it hurt. I was frozen, gripping the sides of my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe. I knew it wasn't human, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard either. As soon as that sound ripped out of the night, the thing took off. It wasn't slow or hesitant. It bolted, crashing through the huckleberry shrubs with a violence that tore at everything in its path. But it didn't just run off in one direction. It ran in wide, looping arcs back and forth, getting closer, then further away, always staying just within earshot. The footsteps pounded like drumbeats, fast and heavy, always 2 at a time. The crashing would move uphill, then cut across, then swing lower until it sounded terrifyingly close. It went on like that for 2 minutes, maybe more. I couldn't make myself move, couldn't even whisper to wake my friend. The thought of unzipping my tent or shining a light into the dark was out of the question. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay still and silent, like if I gave myself away it would turn on me. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps faded, the crashing quieted, and the night swallowed everything up again. The silence afterward was suffocating. I lay there rigid, my heart still hammering, ears straining for any sign that it was still out there. Nothing, just silence so complete that it felt unnatural. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. I don't know how long I lay there, staring into the dark, waiting for the sound of footsteps to return. Eventually, exhaustion must have dragged me down, because the next thing I knew, faint light was filtering into the tent. In the morning, the camp looked completely ordinary, like nothing had happened. My friend was already up boiling water, chipper as if he'd slept like a rock. He hadn't heard a thing. I stepped out of my tent, every muscle in my body still tense, and walked toward the lake. The area was wide open, a gentle slope down to a small beach with mud near the shoreline. That was where I saw the prints. Fresh elk tracks pressed deep into the mud. Big hooves scattered along the edge where one had clearly been standing or moving around in the night. But what caught my eye was a second set of prints not far from them. Large, padded, unmistakably feline. Cougar, most likely. Maybe a bear, though the shape leaned toward cat. That was when it all clicked together. Something had been stalking the elk in the night. Maybe the elk had caught wind of it, maybe it had been chased. Either way, the noise I'd heard, that unearthly, guttural bellow, must have been the elk panicking. It had bolted through the brush, crashing and running wildly, and I just happened to be close enough to hear every second of it. That explanation made sense. It was logical, but it didn't take away the memory of lying in my tent with my heart hammering, convinced some nightmare thing was about to rip me out of my sleeping bag. I kept telling myself it was just an elk, just a cougar or a bear hunting like predators do. But the sound of that bellow and the weight of those footsteps stayed with me. Even now, years later, when I think back to that night, I can still hear the way that call split the silence, deep and terrifying, rolling through the mountains like it came from something that didn't belong there. And I remember how small I felt, zipped up inside a thin nylon tent with nothing but a headlamp and a pocket knife, listening to the raw violence of nature unfold just 100 feet away. It wasn't a ghost or a monster or anything supernatural. It was just the wild doing what the wild does. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. That night taught me something important. When you step into places like that, into valleys and forests that have been there long before you and will be there long after, you aren't really in control. You're just a visitor. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you'll be close enough to hear the way the wild world reminds you of that fact. I remember that trip in the Okefenokee swamp like it happened yesterday, though it's been years since. My girlfriend and I had planned it for months, saving up and reading all the maps, trail notes, and warnings we could find. I had read about the swamp before, how huge it was, how it seemed endless in every direction, with channels that stretched on and on like a maze you could easily get lost in. I wanted to see it for myself. I had always liked remote places, the kind that felt untouched, but this was different. The Okefenokee had a reputation. It wasn't just remote. It was wild in the truest sense. We got there on a warm spring evening. The campground was only half full, scattered tents around us, the sound of people laughing near fires, the hiss of stoves, the occasional splash in the water as a fish jumped or a turtle slid off a log. Even with all those people nearby, I remember feeling like the swamp itself was something separate, like it wasn't really part of the campground. It just started where the ground ended, and from there it went on into a different world altogether. That night, as we settled into our tent, I kept listening to the sounds. The frogs were loud, a constant croaking that rose and fell like waves. Every so often I'd hear something heavier move through the water. I figured it was an alligator, but I didn't see any. The air was heavy with humidity, sticking to my skin, the smell of wet earth and plants strong enough that it filled the tent. I don't think I slept well, not because I was scared, but because it was hard to shut off my mind. I kept thinking about what it would be like to be out in a canoe, alone in all that black water. We woke early the next morning, before the sun had fully burned through the haze. The swamp looked like it was covered with a blanket of fog. It didn't roll like mist does in the mountains. It just sat there, flat and still, resting on the surface of the water like it belonged to it. We carried the canoe down to the launch, the metal scraping against the damp ground, and eased it into the water. I felt the shift under my feet as I climbed in, the canoe rocking side to side before settling. The first paddle strokes cut into the water without a sound. Even though there were other campers not far behind us, the swamp swallowed everything. Within minutes, it felt like we had left the whole world behind. The channel wound between trees that grew straight out of the water, their roots hidden below, their branches draped with gray strands of Spanish moss. It hung so low in places that I felt like it might brush my shoulders. The water itself was dark, so black it looked bottomless. I knew it wasn't deep everywhere, but you couldn't see more than a few inches down. The surface held the reflection of the fog, and it gave me the strange feeling that we were gliding over glass. We paddled for what felt like an hour. The only sounds were the gentle dip of the paddles and the occasional drip of water falling from the blade. I kept expecting to hear a bird, or the croak of a frog, or the buzzing of insects. But there was nothing. The silence was thick. The fog muted everything, even the sound of our canoe sliding forward. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see something move, but there was nothing at all. We rounded a bend, the channel narrowing a little, and that's when I heard it. A sound so deep and raw it vibrated through my chest. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. A guttural bellow that seemed to come from the water itself, echoing off the trees. I froze, my paddle halfway in the air. For a second, I didn't even want to breathe. I had read about alligator bellows, but reading about it and hearing it are two different things. This was primeval, the kind of sound that makes you understand you are in someone else's territory. The water behind us rippled, and I turned just in time to see a pair of eyes break the surface. Then another, and another. In seconds, the black water was dotted with glowing eyes and the ridges of backs. I counted quickly, and it was at least 20, maybe more. They hadn't been there a moment earlier. It was like they had all risen at once. We kept moving forward, slow at first, dipping the paddles carefully. But the bellow came again, even louder, and this time I could tell it wasn't just one. It came from the trees to the right, then from the left, then somewhere ahead. The sound was layered, overlapping, until it felt like the swamp itself was growling. I looked behind again and almost couldn't believe it. More eyes, more ridges. They were trailing us. Every few strokes, I saw another head surface. Big ones, some so large their snouts looked like logs floating on the water. My arms tensed, and I couldn't help but pick up the pace, my paddle cutting faster, harder. As we pressed forward, I saw movement on the banks ahead. Tails sliding down into the water, heavy bodies slipping silently beneath the surface. Ripples spread out in every direction. We weren't just being followed, we were being surrounded. Every turn of my head showed more. I stopped counting after 40. The water behind us was alive with them. The water ahead crowded with more. Then it happened. As I dipped my paddle in, it struck something solid. A massive head broke the surface right where my paddle had gone down. The alligator was enormous, bigger than any I had ever seen in my life. The blow from my paddle had hit it right across the skull, and the response was instant. It thrashed, the water exploding upward, the sound like thunder. Its massive head slammed against the side of our canoe, and the whole boat rocked violently. Water spilled in over the edge, soaking my legs. For a moment, I was sure we were going over. I could see the open jaws, the rows of teeth, the power in that thrash. But just as fast as it appeared, it vanished beneath us, leaving the canoe rocking and my hands trembling on the paddle. I didn't think. I just dug the paddle in and pulled, hard and fast. My girlfriend did the same. The canoe shot forward, but we weren't leaving them behind. We were paddling straight into the thick of it, where more ridges and eyes waited. The water wasn't empty anywhere. Every direction held movement, the faint ripple of something massive just beneath the surface. Another bellow came, so close it felt like the sound was inside my chest. I twisted to look, and there he was. The same huge alligator, the one that had slammed us, had surfaced behind us. Its head was massive, broad, scarred, the kind of animal that had been through decades of survival. It was staring straight at us, its eyes fixed, unblinking. We kept paddling, cutting through the maze of bodies. Each stroke felt too slow, like the water was holding us back. I couldn't tell if they were letting us through or closing us in. The fog thickened around us, and for a few seconds it felt like we were paddling blind, just moving forward because there was no other choice. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the water ahead began to clear. The ridges sank one by one, eyes disappearing below the surface. The bellows grew distant, the way opened, and we slipped forward into a stretch of channel that looked empty again. My arms burned, but I didn't stop. Not until we had gone far enough that the only sound was our own paddles again. When I finally stopped, breathing hard, I turned to look back. The fog had swallowed the place we'd come from. I could see nothing but still water and hanging moss. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, but then I saw him, the big one. He was still there, half-surfaced, his head massive, his eyes locked on us. He didn't move. He just watched. The other gators had gone under, but he stayed, holding that stare. It went on long enough that my chest tightened. Felt like he was deciding something. Then, without a sound, he sank, his head sliding beneath the black water, leaving nothing but ripples. We didn't speak. We just kept paddling until we found a small bank farther up the waterway, a rise of land with enough dry ground to step out. We pulled the canoe onto it and sat there, breathing, listening, waiting. The silence returned, heavy as before, but this time it felt different. It felt like the swamp had shown us its power and then let us go. We sat for a long time, staring at the water, neither of us moving. My hands still shook from the memory of that massive head slamming against the canoe. My ears still rang with the sound of that bellow. The stillness of the swamp had changed for me in that moment. It wasn't just quiet. It was watching. It was holding its breath, waiting for you to understand that you were small here and fragile, and that everything around you could take you if it wanted to. Eventually, we got back in the canoe and made our way slowly, carefully, back toward camp. We didn't see any more alligators on the way, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night, lying in the tent, I listened to the frogs and the splashes in the distance, and all I could think of was that stare. The big one watching us, waiting until he was satisfied we had left his world behind. I'll never forget that, not because anything supernatural happened. There was nothing like that. It was just nature, raw and unfiltered. But it was enough to make me realize how close you can come to being swallowed up out there, and how quickly the swamp can remind you that it doesn't belong to you. This must have been around 1992, though I can't remember the exact month. I was in my early 20s, still that awkward mixture of being old enough to know better but young enough to still act without thinking things through. My friend and I had decided to spend a few days hiking and camping in the Lake District. We both loved being outdoors, carrying everything on our backs, sleeping under canvas, waking up with the sun already warming the fields and the smell of wet grass clinging to the morning air. That year we had started our trip around Borrowdale, following the River Derwent. It was the sort of place where there were always walkers, families with children, day trippers with ice creams, ramblers with dogs, and groups of students looking hungover but determined to make the most of the scenery. It wasn't wild wilderness where you'd go days without seeing anyone, but more like a patchwork of open valleys, wooded sections, and stretches of river where you could still feel alone if you wanted to. That particular afternoon, we were in no rush. The air was warm but not stifling, the kind of temperature where you could walk for hours and never feel dried out. My pack was biting into my shoulders, and I was daydreaming about the packet of biscuits buried somewhere in the top compartment when my friend, who was walking just ahead of me, suddenly stopped dead. I wasn't paying attention, so I walked straight into the back of him with a thump, making him grunt. I was about to mutter something when he just raised his hand slightly without looking at me, telling me to be quiet. He tilted his head toward the river, so I leaned around him to see what he was looking at. At first, my brain didn't process what I was seeing. There, standing right in the middle of the shallow stretch of river, was a man. His shirt was bunched up and tucked under his chin like a bib, and his trousers were gone completely. He was masturbating, totally exposed, his face blank like it was just some regular thing to be doing. The sunlight glinted on the water, the sound of it rushing around the rocks filling the silence, but my eyes were stuck on him. I looked at my friend, who looked back at me with that wide-eyed expression that mixes disbelief with a silent question of, "Are you seeing this too?" The absurdity of it got the better of us. We both stifled a laugh, shook our heads, and backed off. He hadn't noticed us. It was so bizarre and surreal, and in that moment, it felt more stupid than threatening. We didn't say anything, just moved away and picked a different path along the river. We carried on, talking about anything else, both a little rattled but more in a joking way. After a while, we found a good spot to stop for a snack, sitting down on some rocks, letting the straps of our packs rest for a few minutes. The valley was quiet except for the sound of birds and the water moving over the stones. Then we heard something that pulled us out of our easy rest. High-pitched squeals, like girls shouting or laughing, carried across the water. We looked at each other again, the sound coming from further downstream. Curiosity pulled us that way, so we packed up and headed toward the noise. And there he was again, the same man, trousers pooled around his ankles this time, standing brazenly at the riverbank and flashing a group of young girls who were on the opposite side. They looked both startled and confused, squealing and keeping their distance, but unable to ignore him. Something about seeing him target them made the situation shift from ridiculous to ugly. Both of us felt that adolescent rush of anger and righteousness that demanded we do something. But standing there with our scrawny frames and camping gear, we knew we weren't the sort who could wade across and confront a man like that. We were skinny, bookish lads who could barely stand our ground in a pub argument, let alone face down a half-naked pervert in the middle of the woods. Still, doing nothing felt wrong. We whispered quickly about what to do. My friend decided he would jog up to the nearest road to find anyone who could contact the police. Mobile phones weren't a thing for us back then, and even if they were, we wouldn't have been able to afford one. That left me to keep an eye on the man from a distance, to make sure he didn't disappear before my friend came back. I agreed without thinking much about what it meant. I slipped into the trees along the riverbank, crouching down near a large oak where the roots formed a hollow like a little seat. From there, I had a clear view of the man, but was hidden enough that he wouldn't easily spot me. My heart was beating faster now, not with excitement, but with that odd tension that comes from doing something you know you shouldn't, like spying. For a while, he carried on with his performance, but then something must have startled him. Maybe one of the girls shouted for help or a parent started wading across. Whatever it was, he suddenly stopped and climbed up the bank, moving quickly and without hesitation, heading straight into the woods, straight toward where I was hiding. I pressed myself lower into the roots, holding my breath as his footsteps came closer. He passed by within feet of me, his shirt still hiked up, his face damp with sweat. Then he stopped. He turned his head slightly, glancing back through the trees, scanning as though he was checking if someone had followed. He stood there for what felt like forever, his breathing heavy, his eyes moving but never landing on me. My lungs burned from holding still. I didn't dare move a finger. Then, without warning, he turned again and carried on walking, heading through the trees and up toward the road. My legs were stiff when I finally shifted out of the hollow, adrenaline still hot in my veins. I waited a few seconds before I followed at a distance, careful not to let him see me. The woods thinned out until they met the road, and there I saw him cross and make his way to a small car park. My stomach turned when I saw the van he walked up to, an old, beaten thing that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. He got in quickly, pulling the sliding door closed. Just then my friend appeared, jogging back along the road. He'd managed to flag someone down who had agreed to call the police. He was flushed with exertion, but when I told him the man was right there in the van, his eyes widened. We both turned just in time to see the van pull out. I memorized the registration plate, saying it aloud to fix it in my head until I could write it down. Barely a minute later, a police car came down the road at speed, lights flashing and tires squealing. We waved them down, practically throwing ourselves into their path, and blurted out the details: the man, the van, the number plate. The officers' faces lit up in that way people do when they finally get a break in something they've been chasing for too long. They explained quickly that they'd had complaints about this same man for years. People would report him, but by the time they called for help and officers arrived, he'd always melted away. Today might be different. They had a vehicle and a description. They told us to meet them later at the station in Keswick to give full statements. For now, we were to follow them back since we were parked in the same car park. The drive back through the valley was strangely quiet. My friend and I didn't speak much, both replaying the moments in our heads. I checked the rearview mirror at one point and saw the police car behind us slam on its brakes and veer off down a track, lights blazing again. We didn't know what they'd seen, but it was obvious they'd spotted something important. When we arrived at the station, we were taken into a side room and told to keep quiet. After a tense few minutes, one of the officers explained what had happened. They'd found the man again, not far from where we'd last seen him. His shirt was off, his trousers undone, prowling through the woods like he was hunting for his next audience. They'd picked him up, but the problem was the station was small. There were no cells available, so for the time being he was being kept in one of the offices, just a few doors down from where we sat. We gave our initial accounts, but the officers said they'd need us again later for an identification. When we returned, we learned that the man had refused to take part in a formal lineup. Instead, they asked if we'd be willing to be led into the office, look directly at him, and confirm whether or not he was the same man we'd seen. The idea made my stomach twist, but both of us agreed. It wasn't like we lived there, we could confirm and leave. We were walked into the office, the door opening to reveal him sitting there, cuffed but still with that same blank face. His eyes flicked up at us as if measuring whether he was recognized. My skin crawled, but I forced myself to look directly at him. There was no doubt. It was him. Both of us confirmed it, signed the papers, and gave full statements. Felt like something important had been done. Justice, at least in some small way, had been served. We were thanked sincerely, told we might be contacted again if needed, and handed over to the desk sergeant. As we were leaving, the automatic doors sliding shut behind us, we saw a woman storm into the station. Her face was flushed, her eyes flashing with rage. From the snatches of her voice that carried through before the doors closed, we heard her shouting at him, accusing him. "You dirty fucker. You've been doing it again, haven't you?" The finality of it hit then. This wasn't some bizarre one-off we'd stumbled across. It was a pattern, maybe years of it, hidden behind the ordinary mask of a man who went home to a wife and probably pretended to be normal. It chilled me more than anything else, that he wasn't just some strange figure in the river that afternoon, but someone who had been doing this for years, and might have gone on for years more if we hadn't been in the right place at the right time.